Welcome everybody. Tyler and I are very happy to be kicking off this conference, and we're going to do it by giving you a brief introduction to something called species distribution models, which, as Ellie said, are commonly used in wildlife science and which we think may have some benefit for the management of free-roaming dogs and cats. Both of us come from the wildlife population science field, and in that field we spend a lot of our time really addressing a fairly small set of fundamental questions. How many animals of a given species are there in a particular area? Where are they? Are they everywhere, evenly distributed, or are they more likely to be in certain kinds of places than other places? Why are they where they are? Why are they absent from the places that they're not present? These are the sorts of things we spend a lot of time thinking about and working on, and wildlife scientists have developed a very, very large array of tools to try to answer these questions. Obviously, these questions are quite relevant to the management of dog and cat populations that roam freely outdoors. And indeed, the animal welfare organizations that work on these populations have adopted and adapted many of the techniques developed originally in wildlife science to quantify these populations. The thing is that there tends to be a lag time between something becoming commonly used in wildlife science and making its way over to dog and cat population management. So if we think about the evolution of the toolbox that animal welfare has used for these purposes, it started out with the simplest things, data summaries and graphing. There was a period of time when a lot of attention was given to the ability of single proxy variables to be an indicator of dog, or less commonly cat populations, typically human population density. We saw a lot of use of the whole array of mark recite methods. And more recently, we see some of the modern statistical approaches and mapping tools being used more widely. But that's not quite the kind of the state of the art in wildlife science. That is something called species distribution models, or SDMs for short. These are also frequently called niche models if you're from the UK, or habitat suitability models. These occupy a lot of the attention of people in wildlife science. And in a nutshell, they basically combine modern statistical modeling approaches with modern mapping tools to produce predictions of animal distributions over space. And breaking that down in a little more detail, the components of species distribution models start with that statistical model that we talked about. Now, there are many, many, many different varieties of these. But what they all have in common is that a core component of these models is actual field data from dog counting or cat counting or counting of whatever species that we're interested in. Those counts can be expressed in terms of either occurrence, meaning is an animal of this species present or absent at a particular location, or they can be expressed in terms of the density of animals in a particular location. The model also makes use of continuous predictors. In other words, measurements that might be related to the distribution of the animals in question. And by continuous, I mean they have to have a value over the whole area that we're thinking of. So think of something like land cover or elevation that has a value everywhere in space. Many of these models do account for incomplete detection and counts. And basically what they do is they find a mathematical expression based on the predictor variables that best explain the actual field data that have been collected. That is combined with the modern mapping or GIS environment to interpolate these mathematical expressions over all the places in the area of interest that haven't had actual data collected on them to produce a predictive map. So if we go over the same ground in sort of a schematic using a typical wildlife example, we would start out with an area of interest. That's this gray area here. We would then collect actual data to sample that area. That's these blue dots. And in this particular case, those are places where the species of interest has actually been recorded as occurring. Then we'd stack up a bunch of layers of predictive variables, in this case, things like land cover, soils, climate, and terrain. We put all that into the framework that we've been describing, and we end up with this predictive surface that in this particular case displays the predicted suitability of habitat for this animal. Over on the right is a real example from my own work on a bird called the pinyon jay, which occurs in my area. This is the output of a species distribution model with lowest probability of occurrence in the gray color and highest probability in the green color. And so we see a clear pattern here. We always like to see that because that's information. And in this case, what it's telling us is that this particular bird is far more likely to occur in the foothill areas around mountain ranges than it is either in the valleys or at the tops of mountains. Now, one thing to be aware of when we think about how this would be applied to animal welfare, to dogs and cats, is that this schematic would probably change a little bit. We'd probably be collecting relative or absolute density estimate at these points where we get real data. Our predictors they might include land cover, but they probably wouldn't include things like soils, but they might include other things like human population density. And our predicted surface might not be habitat suitability, but it might be predicted density of dogs and cats across the landscape. So that's the idea of these things. Now, a really important, many of you are probably thinking, oh, that would be cool to have for my area. It's really important before you go down this road to have a good sense of what SDMs, species distribution models, are good for and what they're not really appropriately suited for. So what they're really good for is to see bigger patterns. So they're excellent for planning purposes or for creating strategies that involve prioritizing certain parts of the landscape or focusing your resources in intelligent ways. They're also an excellent tool for facilitating population estimates over a large area that you have only sampled. And they're also an excellent tool for trying to dissect and understand the potential reasons for the patterns that you're seeing. Why are animals more common in some kinds of places than others? And you can get to those questions by looking at how these different predictor variables influence the outcome of these models. That's what they're good for. They're really not appropriate tools for local estimation. And what I mean is that if you care about how many dogs there are in a particular area where you haven't actually collected data, you should not rely simply on the prediction from a species distribution model as your definitive answer. You really need to collect some data in that location. These, like all approaches, have some error involved, and the estimates at any particular point in space could certainly be wrong. Good species distribution models do depict overall patterns well, but locally, not so well necessarily. And then finally, if your main interest is monitoring changes in populations over time, this technique is really overkill. There are simpler, well-established techniques that do a good job for less money. So with that said, I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague Tyler, who's going to get into the weeds a little bit, so to speak, and provide you with some more details about species distribution models. And I will turn it over to him.
There we go. Okay, let's share the screen here and continue on. Thanks, John. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through a little bit of an example of a species distribution model. And I sort of hope that this will give everybody an idea of sort of what's needed and what to think about if this is something that you might want to include in your work. And I think quite often we get this idea of what the output is going to be, but we don't really know what the inputs are. What do we need to actually produce this type of scientific information? So as John mentioned, there's two ways to think about species distribution models. One is the probability of occurrence, and the other is the relative density or the absolute density of animals. And I'm going to walk you through an example of some data that John and I have collected on the island of Maui in the Hawaiian Islands. And as you can see from this simple map, the dots on the island are the locations where we have collected data. And the data that we've collected there are observations of free roaming cats. And so if we think about the probability of occurrence, what we're looking for is the presence or absence of cats at each one of these locations. And so I've color-coded the observations where cats have been seen, they're green, and where cats have not been seen, they're red. The second type of data that we can collect is actual counts of the number of cats. And so here we're looking at the relative abundance. And here each dot, instead of showing presence or absence of cats, is showing the number of cats that were actually counted at each one of those locations. Now, when you look at these two maps, you can start to see some patterns starting to form, right? We can see that there are certainly clusters of larger circles on this image, and there's locations where you might see a little bit of clustering of locations where there aren't cats. And so the question becomes, well, what is underlying those data? And what explains those data? And underlying every species distribution model is a statistical model, as John mentioned. So if we take these simple data that we're looking at here, so these are the counts of cats at these locations, and we use a simple model and we compare three different attributes. The first is that we think that the density of cats varies across the island and it's constant across the island. So there's really no predictors of any significance to predict the number of cats. And in that case, this is called a null model, which means that there's no effect and everything is constant across the island. The second is that we can think about attributes that may predict the number of cats, leading to human conditions and socioeconomic status. So in this case, we've considered poverty levels, as well as household income. And these are simple metrics that you can get usually from census data in most countries. And thankfully, that data is usually spatially explicit, which means that it covers a certain geographic area. So for a given geographic area, we can have a level of the poverty index, and for areas, we can also have an estimate of the median household income. So when we run three different models and we can compare them using an approach called AIC. And basically what we're looking for here is the lowest AIC value, which is the top one, and the variable is income. And based on looking at these models, we can say that income is probably the only explanation for the number of cats that's found on the island. So the reason why we want to compare different models is that we want to understand why the patterns are the way that they are. And we're really interested in understanding the causal mechanisms that underlie these relationships. But figuring out the underlying causal mechanisms is really difficult. And usually it needs to be done through experimentation or direct interventions. And as John stated before, basically what we're doing is we're developing models that give us information about where cats or dogs may occur on the landscape and what those patterns may be. But we need to be really cautious when we use these results and then extrapolate them or interpolate them across a geographic area. And I want to give you an example of that using the data that we have here in Maui. So if we think about the best supported model income, and then we plot the predicted number of cats that are counted across income, this is the relationship that we find. It's a negative relationship, which means that lower median household income levels, we have a predicted higher number of cats. And at higher household income levels, we expect fewer numbers of cats. So there's this negative relationship that exists. And of course, because we're using data that has variation in it, there's some confidence around that estimate. So that's what that light blue band is. And then the dark line is the mean predictor. But when we take that same relationship and we actually plot the data on it, so here we're looking at the dots, which is the predicted number of cats the actual number of cats and the median household income in the locations where they were sampled, we can see that there's quite a bit of variation in that data. So we can see that blue line on the full scale, and we need to look at this and understand, okay, there's a lot of variation in this data, and perhaps the exact reason why we expected a negative relationship between median household income and cats may not exist, or it may be predicted by other factors that we simply haven't measured. But an important thing to remember is that when we're extrapolating these data, we need to be really cautious of the data that we have collected and that we haven't collected. And John mentioned this before. How do we extrapolate to areas where we haven't sampled when we haven't sampled across the entire range of the variables that we're interested in? So here again are the data, and I've plotted the relationship from median household income of 0 all the way up to $250,000. And this is an example of the potential range that may occur on the island. And as you can see, the extrapolation starts above 90 and goes down to almost 0. Now, on the left-hand side, I've plotted the data again. So these points again are the same data that we just saw, the actual estimates of, or the actual counts of the cats, given the median household income in the locations where they were sampled. And as we can see, we're really only sampling a really narrow range of the median household incomes that are potentially available across the island of Maui. And so what we need to do is we need to be very, very cautious about what these results tell us and how we might apply them. Because if we really want to be able to apply these data, we should be sampling across the whole range of median household income. And we need to be extremely cautious about extrapolating beyond where those measurements are made. So in this case, we're looking between those two vertical dashed lines, and we can have a fairly good confidence that the true relationship is robust between those narrow lines. Outside of those lines, it becomes slightly problematic on how we do that. So I just want to finish up by saying that SDMs are hard. These are statistical models that require a little bit of expertise in how to develop them, how to interpolate them, and how to draw inference from them. And so John and I would say that help is necessary, but it is available. And John and I are developing an online toolkit that we're calling Companion Animal Tools that we hope to launch later on this year. And this is one of the tools that might be available in Companion Animal Tools, as you can see on the left-hand side, where it's an online tool where you can enter the data that you have. It can walk through the model selection and the development of that and control some of the outputs. So this basically allows us to give some scientific oversight to the data that people are bringing to ensure that the models that we develop are strong and that the results that we're producing and the inference that we're drawing is robust and correct. Because the last thing we want to do is use limited data to try and draw sweeping conclusions about cats and dog populations, because that really doesn't get us closer to our goal of understanding where cats and dogs occur and how many occur on the landscape. So with that, I'd just like to say that John and I are really interested to hear from people. If you have questions or if you are interested in this sort of idea, we're happy to always talk and answer a few questions if you have them. Thank you very much.